The slap echoed through the dining room like a gunshot, sharp and final, cutting through the soft murmur of crystal glasses and expensive conversation. Every head in the restaurant turned. Forks hovered midair. A woman near the window pressed her hand to her mouth. And in the sudden, suffocating silence that followed, Ashley Whitmore stood with her palms still raised. Her lips curled into a smile that had been practiced in front of mirrors since childhood, the smile of a girl who had never once been told no. The woman she had struck did not cry. She did not flinch. She did not back away. She simply stood very still, the way a person stands when they have already decided how the next chapter ends. Ashley did not know it yet, but she had just made the single most catastrophic mistake of her 26 years on this earth. And the woman she had slapped was about to make one phone call that would unravel everything her father had spent 2 decades building. Maya Brooks had returned to Caldwell City on a Tuesday, which she always thought was the most honest day of the week. Not the false optimism of Monday, not the relief of Friday, just Tuesday, plain and purposeful, asking nothing of you except that you show up. She had driven in from the airport herself, declining the offer of a car service, preferring the anonymity of a rental sedan with the windows cracked and the radio off. She liked to think when she arrived somewhere new or somewhere old. Caldwell City was both for her. She had grown up in the eastern neighborhoods, in a row house with a narrow porch, and a father who kept stacks of folders on the kitchen table long after dinner was cleared away. She had left at 18 and spent the decade that followed moving through rooms that mattered: law school in Philadelphia, a fellowship in New York, 3 years with a nonprofit oversight coalition in Washington before transitioning into independent investigative consulting. She was 28 years old. She looked younger. People often mistook that for weakness. She had long since stopped correcting them. She was not beautiful in the way that magazines described beauty, but she was striking dark skin that caught light and held it, a stillness about her face that made people feel both seen and slightly unnerved. She wore her hair natural, close cropped, and her clothes were always clean and simple, the kind of wardrobe that communicated nothing except that she had better things to think about than what she was wearing. She drove through the city slowly, noting what had changed and what had not. The waterfront had been redeveloped. There were new hotels where the old cannery used to stand. The north side had a greenway now, lined with young trees and bicycle lanes, and banners along the lamp posts read, "Caldwell City, moving forward together," with the mayor's name printed discreetly at the bottom. Mayor Richard Whitmore. She had read everything published about him in the past 18 months. She had also read everything that had not been published, which was considerably more interesting. Richard Whitmore was 54 years old and had served as mayor of Caldwell City for 6 years. He was tall, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of easy confidence that came not from competence, but from a lifetime of being told that he belonged wherever he stood. The press loved him. He gave good sound bites. He showed up at community events with his sleeves rolled up and his teeth gleaming, and he had perfected the art of saying very little while sounding like he was saying everything. He had been re-elected once already, winning by a margin that his campaign called historic and that independent analysts called suspicious but ultimately unprovable. He was currently in the final stretch of his campaign for a second re-election, and the polling numbers were strong. His approval rating was 61%. His daughter's approval rating, if such a thing had been measured, would have told a very different story. Ashley Whitmore had spent her 26 years inhabiting a world that bent around her. She was her father's only child from his first marriage, and she had grown up in the shadow of his ambitions without ever being required to develop any of her own. She was conventionally attractive in a way that photographed well, which had led to a brief attempt at modeling at 20 that she now described, depending on her audience, as either a passion project or a calculated business venture. Neither was accurate. She had a gift for spending money and a talent for identifying people who could be useful to her, and she moved through Caldwell City's social landscape with the absolute assurance of someone who had never once considered the possibility that the landscape might not be designed for her. The press covered her social appearances with the obligatory warmth they extended to all political families, but off the record, the reporters who dealt with her were less charitable. She had, over the years, managed to avoid consequences for a long list of minor cruelties, a server she had screamed at in a restaurant in 2019, a parking dispute that had required a quiet phone call from City Hall to make disappear, a former friend who had attempted to go public with a story about Ashley's behavior at a charity auction and had ultimately, inexplicably, declined to give any further interviews. These things happened. They were managed. That was the nature of being Richard Whitmore's daughter in Caldwell City. Maya had not come back to the city because of Ashley. She had come back because of a man named Gerald Holt, who had been the deputy director of the city's infrastructure procurement office for 11 years before he had been quietly reassigned to a desk position with no staff and no authority. Gerald had reached out to Maya through a mutual contact 3 months ago. He had documents, he had emails, he had, most importantly, the kind of institutional memory that could not be shredded or deleted because it lived inside a person who had been present for every meeting, every handshake, every decision that had been made in rooms where the minutes were kept deliberately vague. Maya had spent those 3 months verifying what Gerald had told her, building the file piece by piece, cross referencing names and dates and contract numbers until the picture was undeniable. Tonight, she was meeting him at the Meridian, the most expensive restaurant in Caldwell City, which Gerald had suggested because he said it was the last place anyone would expect them to meet. She had agreed. She had also thought that it was exactly the kind of place where, if something went wrong, there would be plenty of witnesses. She parked the car 2 blocks from the restaurant and walked the rest of the way, her low heels quiet on the sidewalk. The evening air was warm and soft with the particular sweetness of late summer, and the city glittered around her in a way that was almost convincing. She pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Meridian at 7:43, gave her name to the host, and was escorted to the VIP section near the back, a quieter enclave of white tablecloths and low amber lighting, where the serious people came to have conversations that were not meant to be overheard. She sat down, ordered water, and checked her phone. Gerald was 10 minutes out. She folded her hands on the table and waited, as she had learned to do, with the patience of someone who understood that the most important moments never arrived on schedule. She did not hear Ashley Whitmore come in so much as feel her the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, the way conversations tilted and glances redirected, the particular quality of attention that attached itself to a person who had spent years commanding it. Ashley arrived with 4 companions, all of them dressed for spectacle, trailing a wake of expensive perfume and louder than necessary laughter. The host greeted her by name. She did not thank him. She surveyed the room the way a general surveys a field, assessing, categorizing, dismissing, and her eyes landed on Maya, with the particular pause of someone who has encountered something that does not fit their established categories. Maya noticed this. She returned her attention to the table. Ashley's group settled 2 tables away, which was close enough for their conversation to be an ambient presence, a tide of references and names that were meant to be heard. Ashley ordered champagne without looking at the wine list. One of her friends said something that made the others laugh, and Ashley smiled with her whole face except her eyes, which remained fixed intermittently on Maya. This was the part that Maya recognized. She had seen it before, in other rooms, in other cities. The slow consideration, the decision being made. She kept her expression neutral and her posture easy, and she did not look up, because looking up would invite engagement, and she did not want engagement. She wanted Gerald to arrive. She wanted the documents. She wanted to be done with this particular evening and back in her hotel room with a yellow legal pad and several hours of uninterrupted thought. But Ashley Whitmore had never learned to leave things alone. She made a remark, loud enough to carry, about certain people thinking they could sit anywhere. One of her friends giggled. The remark was not directed at anyone in particular, and was directed at everyone in particular, and it was the kind of comment that was designed to be heard without being attributable. Maya said nothing. Ashley made another remark. This one, about standards slipping. The champagne arrived. Ashley accepted her glass without acknowledgement, took a sip, and then stood. Maya heard her stand. She did not look up. Ashley crossed the distance between their tables in 4 steps, and Maya could feel the weight of the room's attention shifting, a held breath spreading outward from their corner like a wave. "Excuse me," Ashley said. Her voice was pleasant and precise, the voice of someone who had been told all her life that she was articulate. I think you might be in the wrong section. Maya looked up then. She met Ashley's eyes and said, simply and clearly, I don't think so. Ashley's expression flickered surprise at the absence of deference, recalibration. This area is reserved, she said. I have a reservation, Maya said. The flickering became something harder. Ashley was not accustomed to being contradicted in a single declarative sentence with no accompanying apology, and the absence of apology seemed to be what finally ignited the sequence of decisions that culminated in what happened next. There were words, Ashley's words, mostly, clipped and escalating, the grievances of someone who had mistaken their own discomfort for injustice. Maya responded once more, briefly, without raising her voice. And then Ashley, in front of 43 people who would later give statements, raised her right hand and brought it across Maya's face. The sound it made was flat and definitive. The room went completely still. Ashley stood there in the silence, with her hand still half raised, and the smile that moved across her face in the seconds after was automatic, the reflex of someone who expected the world to absorb what she had done and rearrange itself around the fact of it, as it always had. Her friends were watching. A few of them had their phones out. Behind Maya, a man near the bar had risen to his feet and then sat back down again, uncertain. The maitre d' had gone very pale. No one spoke, no one moved, and then Maya reached up and very carefully, very deliberately, touched the corner of her mouth. She examined her fingertips. She set them back down on the table. She reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and removed her phone. Her face, for those 43 witnesses, was entirely composed. She dialed a number that she knew by memory and pressed the phone to her ear. The call lasted 31 seconds. Eleanor, Maya said. It's time. Yes, we're ready. The Meridian. I'll explain when you get here. A pause. Thank you. She set the phone on the table, face down. Ashley was watching her with an expression that had begun as triumph and was curling at the edges into something less certain. That's it? She said. You're going to sit there and make a phone call? Her friends made sounds of appreciation. Someone said something that was meant to be cutting. Maya said nothing. She poured herself a glass of water from the carafe on the table and took a sip and set the glass down and waited. The next 9 minutes were the longest Ashley Whitmore had ever experienced, though she did not know yet that she was experiencing them. She returned to her table. She finished her champagne and ordered another. She made conversation. She laughed, though the laughter had changed in quality, become slightly effortful, the way laughter does when the person producing it is also, beneath it, listening for something they cannot identify. At the 8-minute mark, one of her friends looked toward the restaurant's entrance and went quiet. At the 9-minute mark, Ashley looked too. 3 black SUVs had parked along the curb outside, their engines off, their occupants already moving. Men and women in dark suits came through the restaurant's glass doors with the efficient, purposeful movement of people who did not need to be told where to go, who had been briefed already, and had simply been waiting for the signal. The maitre d' stepped forward, and then stepped back. 2 of the suited figures showed credentials without breaking stride. The other diners had gone very still, the way people go still when they recognize that something is happening around them that they do not yet understand, and the not understanding is somehow more alarming than the thing itself. Behind the suited figures walked a woman in her mid-50s, silver-streaked hair, pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped caring about whether her hair looked intentional and arrived instead at the stage, where it simply looked right. A dark blazer, low heels, and the expression of someone who had spent 30 years making consequential decisions in difficult rooms and had become, through that experience, very calm about all of it. She moved through the restaurant without looking left or right, her attention entirely directed, and she moved directly to Maya's table. Maya, the woman said, and there was something in her voice warmth. Yes, but also a particular quality of respect that you could not perform, that had to be earned and given genuinely. Eleanor, Maya said, rising briefly. Thank you for coming. Ashley stared. She knew the face. She had seen it in news photographs, in the kind of formal coverage that appeared in national outlets when something significant was announced at the federal level. Eleanor Grant. She had been appointed Special Federal Inspector General 18 months ago, a position created specifically for a broad scope investigation into municipal corruption in several mid sized American cities. Ashley knew this because her father had mentioned the appointment with the particular studied neutrality of someone who does not want to appear concerned. Ashley had not, at the time, thought further about it. She thought about it now. Eleanor Grant did not look at Ashley. She sat across from Maya and opened a leather portfolio and said, in a low, clear voice, "The warrant is signed. The team is staged. We can move tonight or we can move tomorrow, depending on where you are with the Holt meeting." Maya nodded once and began to speak, and Eleanor listened with the attentiveness of someone receiving information she had waited a long time to receive, and Ashley watched all of this from 2 tables away, with the first real fear she had felt in years settling into her chest like cold water. One of Ashley's friends leaned over and whispered, "Who is that woman?" Ashley did not answer. She was doing the mathematics of the situation, running the variables, trying to find the angle from which this made sense, from which she remained the most important person in the room. She could not find it. The calculus kept returning the same result, and the result was that she had walked into the Meridian tonight and had committed an act of public cruelty against a woman who was not what she appeared to be, and the consequences of that act had just become significantly larger than a restaurant incident. The documents that Maya spread on the table told a story that had been building for 6 years. It began with a contract, a city infrastructure contract for the repair and upgrade of Caldwell City's water treatment facilities, awarded in the spring of the current mayor's first term to a company called Meridian Structural Solutions, which was not related to the restaurant, but whose name Maya had noted privately with a grim sense of irony. The contract was worth $140 million. Independent engineering assessments, obtained by Maya's team through a combination of public records, requests, and source testimony, indicated that the actual scope of the work could have been completed for approximately $89 million. The difference, $51 million, had not been absorbed into legitimate cost overruns. It had been distributed through a series of shell companies and consulting arrangements into the hands of 11 individuals, 7 of whom were directly connected to Richard Whitmore's campaign infrastructure, 2 of whom sat on city boards that Richard had personally appointed, and 1 of whom was Richard's brother-in-law, who operated a project management firm in Delaware. This was the first contract. There were 4 others. Gerald Holt had known about all of them. He had known because he had been present in the room, at the table, in the meetings where the decisions were made, and because he was the kind of man who kept notes not out of malice, but out of the lifelong professional habit of someone who understood that institutional memory was fragile and that the only way to protect it was to write things down. He had written things down for 11 years. He had kept those notes in a safe in his home, and when the reassignment came and the writing on the wall became too clear to ignore, he had reached out through a careful chain of contacts until his name found Maya, or Maya's name found him, depending on how you told the story. He arrived at the Meridian 18 minutes after Eleanor, and he sat at Maya's table with the contained, deliberate stillness of a man who has made a decision that cost him a great deal and has resolved not to undo it, and he delivered the last piece of what Maya needed in the form of a small encrypted drive and a handwritten letter that he said was his formal statement. Ashley had stopped pretending not to watch. She sat rigid in her chair, her champagne untouched, as federal investigators moved quietly through the restaurant and as, outside the windows, a growing number of vehicles had gathered in the kind of unhurried, professional formation that meant something was already in motion that would not be stopped. She heard her father's name, not shouted, not accusatory, just spoken, in the course of a conversation at that table, the way you speak a name when it is simply a fact among other facts. Richard Whitmore. She heard it and felt something cold move through her. Richard Whitmore received his emergency call at 11:47 that night. He was in his home study, still in his dinner clothes, reviewing polling numbers with his chief of staff strong numbers, the kind that made a second re-election feel like a formality when the number appeared on his screen. It was a contact he knew and did not want to see calling at this hour, at any hour, a contact whose name in his phone was simply a set of initials and who represented a category of problem he had always managed to keep at a safe, theoretical distance. He excused himself from the room with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to performing composure in front of subordinates. He took the call in private. He stood at the window of his study and looked out at the Caldwell City skyline. At the lights of the city, he had governed for 6 years and intended to govern for 6 more. The waterfront he had helped redevelop, the greenway he had cut the ribbon on, the buildings that bore the imprint of his administration in ways both visible and not. And he listened to what he was told with the expression of a man who has spent a great deal of energy building a structure that he believed, somehow, was stronger than it was. He said very little. He asked 3 questions. He ended the call and stood at the window for a long time without moving. In the next room, his chief of staff waited with the polling numbers still spread across the table, and the numbers said 61%. And the numbers would never again mean what they had meant at 7:45 that evening. His first response, in the days that followed, was the response of a man who had always been able to make problems disappear. He called his lawyers, 3 of them, a firm in the city and a firm in the capital, and a personal attorney who had handled sensitive matters for him for 15 years. He made phone calls to people who owed him favors, to city council members, to a federal liaison, whose loyalty Richard had assumed was purchased and permanent. He had his communications director prepare statements characterizing the investigation as politically motivated, as a campaign attack dressed in legal clothing, as an effort by his opponents to kneecap a reformist mayor who had made enemies precisely because he had been effective. The statements were polished and confident, and they said almost nothing specific, because specificity was dangerous, but they were delivered with conviction. He also made calls of a different kind. 2 witnesses in the Holt chain received visits from individuals they did not recognize, who said things that were carefully worded to stop just short of explicit threat, but that communicated, unmistakably, what kind of pressure could be applied and would be applied if cooperation continued. One witness called Maya's team immediately afterward and reported the contact, which became part of the file under the heading of witness intimidation. Another witness, a former procurement officer named Sandra Kelleher, received 3 anonymous text messages in 2 days, and then a voicemail from a number that traced to a burner phone purchased in cash at a convenience store on the east side of the city. Sandra Kelleher had worked in municipal government for 22 years. She was not easily frightened. She kept the voicemail and turned it over to Eleanor Grant's office. Maya, meanwhile, received a different kind of pressure. An anonymous email sent through a routing chain that her tech contact traced to a server registered to a dummy LLC with a Caldwell City business address informed her that her investigative license was under review, that complaints had been filed with 2 oversight boards, and that it would be in her professional and personal interest to redirect her attention elsewhere. She read the email twice, forwarded it to Eleanor's office, and did not respond. A colleague she respected called her with a careful suggestion that the Whitmore case was acquiring political complexity that could affect future work, that there were ways to structure an exit that preserved her credibility, that sometimes the strategic choice was the one that kept you in the game for the next fight. Maya listened to all of this. She thanked her colleague for the call. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of her hotel room, and she thought about her father. Marcus Brooks had been a city employee for 23 years. He had worked in the public works department of a different city in a different state, and he had been quiet and steady and had believed, with a stubbornness that might have looked like naivety to some people, that the systems of accountability that governed public institutions were real and meant something. In the spring of Maya's sophomore year of high school, he had found evidence of contract fraud in his department. He had reported it through the appropriate channels. The appropriate channels had not responded appropriately. He had gone higher. He had gone to the press. He had lost his job. And then, In the months of legal and institutional pressure that followed, his health, and he had died of a heart attack at 52, 4 years before the investigation he had triggered finally concluded, 4 years before the officials he had named were charged, 4 years before anyone said publicly that Marcus Brooks had been right. Maya had been 23 when the case finally closed. She had read the announcement in a news brief while eating lunch at her desk in a Philadelphia office, and she had not cried, because she had already done that grieving, but she had felt something clarify inside her. The way a lens clarifies when you turn the ring to the right position, and she had understood what the rest of her working life was going to look like. She did not share this story widely. She was not a person who used personal pain as a credential, but she carried it with her the way you carry anything that has become part of your architecture. Not in your hands, not displayed, but load bearing, structural, present in everything you build. She went back to work. The public hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in September, convened by a joint oversight committee with federal participation under Eleanor Grant's office. The hearing room in the Civic Center was large enough to seat 300 members of the public, and every seat was filled. Richard Whitmore arrived with his legal team and his communications director, and the particular bearing of someone who has decided that the only available posture is confidence and has committed to it entirely. He wore a charcoal suit and a blue tie, his campaign colors, and he was greeted by a cluster of supporters near the entrance who held signs reading, "Stand Strong Mayor Whitmore," and he pressed flesh and smiled for photographs as though this were a campaign event and not a federal proceeding. He was given time to speak. He spoke for 12 minutes. He characterized the investigation as the product of political vengeance, as a coordinated assault by interests threatened by his reform agenda, as an attempt to silence a public servant who had dared to hold powerful people accountable. He was, in terms of pure delivery, impressive. His voice was steady. His pauses were well placed. He made eye contact with the committee members in the front row and with the cameras in the back of the room, and he gave the appearance of a man who was indignant rather than afraid. In the gallery, his supporters nodded. The room held its breath. Then Maya stood up. She presented for 47 minutes. She had appeared before oversight committees before, in Washington and in other cities, and she had learned that the most effective presentation was also the most restrained. No theatrics, no rhetorical flourishes, just the documents, the dates, the numbers, the names, laid out in sequence with the clarity of someone who has spent months ensuring that every fact is verifiable by an independent party. She went through each contract. She identified each company. She traced each payment through its routing, its shell structure, its eventual resting place. She displayed the procurement emails on the screens above the committee table, and the emails were specific and dated, and were written in the ordinary, unguarded language of people who believe their communications are private. She named the 11 individuals. She identified their relationships to the mayor. She presented Gerald Holt's formal testimony, and Gerald himself was seated 2 rows behind her, wearing his best suit, and he nodded once when his name was read into the record. Several committee members had begun the session with the skeptical, slightly defensive posture of people who suspected political motivation. Several of them stopped looking skeptical somewhere around the 40-minute mark. One, a council member, who had been publicly aligned with Richard for 3 terms, asked to be excused from the room during the recess and did not return. Ashley sat in the gallery. She had come because she had felt, with the obstinate loyalty of a child, that she owed her father her presence, that showing up was the minimum she could do. She had dressed carefully, and she had sat down next to her mother's sister, who had driven 4 hours to be here because she loved Richard's family, even if she had never entirely trusted Richard himself. Ashley watched her father speak and felt the familiar pride mixed with the unfamiliar chill that had been living in her chest since the night at the Meridian. And then she watched Maya stand up, and she watched the committee members' faces change, and she watched the screens above the committee table fill with words and numbers and names, and somewhere in the second half of Maya's presentation, Ashley stopped breathing quite normally for a while. She recognized the name of her uncle's company. She had known it was involved in city contracts. Her father had mentioned it years ago as a good example of local business supporting civic growth, and she had not thought further about it, because she had not wanted to think further about it, because there were things you did not examine when you loved someone, and when your life was constructed on the foundation of their reputation. She recognized other things too, dates that corresponded to conversations she had half overheard, names she had seen in her father's phone, the particular shape of a kind of truth she had been successfully avoiding for a very long time. She did not cry in the hearing room. She sat very straight, and she kept her face still, and she watched everything unfold with the expression of someone witnessing an accident they cannot prevent. And when the recess was called, she walked to the nearest bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at her own face in the mirror for a long moment. She did not recognize what she saw there. That was, in retrospect, the beginning of something. The final witness had not been announced. He appeared during the afternoon session, after a brief closed consultation between Eleanor Grant and the committee chair, introduced only as a former employee of the city's executive communications office. His name was David Park. He was 34 years old, and he had worked as a recording secretary for private meetings of the mayor's senior staff for 3 years, before resigning without public explanation 14 months ago. He carried a tablet in a protective case, and when the committee chair asked him to present his evidence, he set the tablet on the witness table and connected it to the room's audio system and pressed play. What followed was 42 seconds of audio. The recording was clear ambient sound of an interior room, then voices. One voice was immediately recognizable to everyone in the room who had heard it for the past 12 minutes, because it was the same voice that had characterized this investigation as a political assault, as a vendetta, as a fabrication. Richard Whitmore's voice, in the recording, did not sound indignant. It sounded brisk and specific. It directed, in clear terms, the specific mechanism by which a contract would be awarded to a company that would then distribute funds through a prearranged schedule to a set of named parties. The instructions included a dollar amount. They included a timeline. They included a phrase, the same way we handled the Riverside account, that corresponded directly to a contract Maya had presented in the first half of her presentation. The room was very quiet when the recording ended. Richard Whitmore sat at the respondent's table and did not move for several seconds. Then he conferred briefly with his attorney. His attorney requested a recess. The recess was granted. Richard walked out of the room with his legal team arrayed around him, and he did not look at the gallery, and he did not look at his daughter. And Ashley watched him go with an expression that was very far away from the girl who had stood in the Meridian 2 weeks ago and raised her hand against a stranger. The communications director issued a statement that evening characterizing the recording as potentially doctored and promising a thorough legal response. The legal response never fully materialized. Two of Richard's major campaign donors announced by morning that they were suspending their financial support pending the outcome of the investigation. By noon, his party's state chair had released a statement expressing concern and calling for cooperation with federal investigators. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 city council members who had been reliable allies had issued statements distancing themselves from the mayor's office. Richard's approval rating, which had been 61% before the hearing, was not measured publicly for several weeks, but internal polling conducted for the party showed that it had fallen to 23% by the end of that week. He tendered his resignation on a Monday morning in a brief written statement that his communications director read aloud at a press conference because Richard did not appear. The absence was noted. Reporters who had covered his administration for years sat in the press room with their recorders on and their notebooks open, and they listened to the communications director's voice recede into the formal language of managed retreat. And several of them wrote in their notebooks not what was said, but what was not the apology, not the acknowledgement, not the admission, none of the things that the people who had been harmed might have found meaningful. The statement cited a desire to prioritize his family and to allow the city to move forward without distraction. It did not use the word sorry. Outside the Civic Center, a small group of supporters had gathered with signs, and when the statement was read, they received it in silence. And some of them folded their signs and walked back to their cars. And some of them stayed because they did not know what else to do. And the morning moved forward around all of them regardless. Ashley lost things gradually, And then all at once, the way you lose most things that were never entirely yours. The friends who had been with her at the Meridian dispersed over the following weeks with the efficiency of people who had always been calculating and who had simply revised their calculations. The messages that had once arrived constantly, the plans, the invitations, the casual observations that had formed the texture of a shared social life slowed first and then stopped, not dramatically, but with the particular fade of something that no longer has a reason to continue. Invitations she had expected did not come. Events she would normally have attended appeared in her feed, photographed by other people, full of faces she recognized arranged into configurations that no longer included her. She did not experience this as persecution, which surprised her. She experienced it mostly as silence, and the silence gave her, for the first time in years, an amount of unscheduled time that she did not know what to do with. The video of the slap captured on 3 different phones and circulated before anyone thought to do anything about it became the image that most people associated with Ashley Whitmore, and it was not flattering. It showed her clearly, in good lighting, doing something undeniable, and it was attached to her name in a way that no public statement could detach. She stopped going to the places she had always gone. She stopped attending the events on her calendar. She sat in her apartment, which was large and expensively furnished, and suddenly very quiet, and she understood what it felt like to be in a room that was designed entirely for a version of you that no longer existed. She found Maya through a mutual contact, a city official who had known both of them tangentially in different contexts, and who had, when Ashley reached out, expressed neither surprise nor disapproval. She asked if Maya would meet her. She did not give a reason. Maya agreed, which surprised her. They met at a coffee shop on the east side of the city, the kind of unremarkable place where no one would recognize either of them or care. Ashley arrived first and sat in a corner booth and ordered coffee she did not drink and spent the 12 minutes before Maya arrived, rehearsing what she intended to say and discarding each version as inadequate. When Maya walked in and sat across from her, Ashley looked at her directly for the first time since the Meridian, not as a category, not as a target, but as a person who was also just sitting in a coffee shop booth, and she said, "I'm sorry. I need you to know that I know it was wrong, and I know an apology doesn't fix it. And I'm not here because I want something from you. I'm just here because it was wrong, and I wanted to say so to your face." She had intended to say more, but she found she had said what she needed to, and so she stopped. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I appreciate you coming." Her voice was even and without performance. She looked at Ashley the way she looked at most things, steadily, with attention, without hurry. "I don't carry it as a wound," she said, "but I want you to understand something. The way you treated me in that restaurant that wasn't about me. I could have been anyone. You made a calculation about who I was based on what I looked like and where I was sitting, and you acted on it. That's the thing worth examining. Not what happened to your father, not what happened to you after, the moment before, why you made that calculation." Ashley looked down at her coffee. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it." "Good," Maya said. Then, "Power doesn't make anyone large. It just makes their choices louder. What makes someone large is how they treat the people from whom they have nothing to gain." She said it without the cadence of a speech, just conversationally, the way you say something you believe. Ashley did not speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was different from the voice she had used in the Meridian, smaller, and somehow more real for it. "I want to do something useful," Ashley said, "with whatever I have left. I know that sounds like, I know it might sound self serving, but I need to do something that isn't for me." Maya looked at her. "Then do it," she said. "Find something worth doing, and do it badly at first, and get better at it. That's all it is." Ashley did find something. It took her longer than she expected, and was less dramatic than she had imagined, because it turned out that doing useful things was almost never dramatic. It was paperwork and early mornings and conversations with people who were skeptical of you and had every reason to be. She began volunteering with a community legal aid organization on the south side of the city, the kind of place where the waiting room was always full and the staff was always stretched, and every case mattered enormously to someone, even when it seemed, from the outside, like a small thing. The South Side was not a part of the city Ashley had spent time in before. She had driven through it occasionally, in the back of cars going somewhere else, and had not looked hard enough to see it. Now she looked. She took the bus on days when she could not bear the self-consciousness of parking her car outside a building where the clients came in with their problems in folders and their children in tow and their careful, exhausted dignity in full view. She was not good at the work initially. She made mistakes born of assumption. She spoke when she should have listened. She brought solutions to problems that had not yet been fully explained to her, and she learned slowly, with corrections she received in the form of patient repetitions, and occasionally in the form of direct and unhappy feedback, that the most useful thing she could do in most rooms was to be quiet and attentive and present without an agenda. She had not previously understood what being present without an agenda felt like. She was learning. She stayed. Richard Whitmore was formally indicted on 7 counts of fraud, contract manipulation, and obstruction of justice in the winter following his resignation. His trial was scheduled for the following year. 3 other city officials were indicted alongside him. Sandra Kelleher received a public commendation from Eleanor Grant's office for her cooperation with the investigation. Gerald Holt, who had gone to considerable personal cost to bring the truth to light, received a quieter acknowledgement, a handwritten note from Maya, and a letter from Eleanor's office formally clearing his record. He had been reassigned and sidelined for doing his job correctly for 11 years, and there was no adequate remedy for that. But there was at least the restoration of the record. Caldwell City hired an interim mayor and announced a comprehensive review of all municipal contracts awarded in the previous 6 years. The process was expected to take 18 months and would almost certainly result in additional indictments. The city's Ethics Commission, which had been functionally dormant under Richard's administration, was reconstituted with 3 new members and given expanded authority. The infrastructure repair contract, the original $51 million discrepancy, was reopened, and the work that had been incompletely performed was rebid on a transparent process with independent oversight. It was awarded to a firm from a neighboring state at a cost of $44 million, 31% less than what the original contractor had charged. Maya did not stay in Caldwell City for the outcome of the trial. She was not the type to stay for outcomes. She had made her contribution to the file. Eleanor's team and the federal prosecutors would carry it the rest of the way. She had other cases, other cities, other carefully compiled files in encrypted drives and legal pads, and the particular filing system in her memory that had been built through years of following paper trails from their visible ends back to their hidden sources. She packed the rental car on a Friday morning and drove out of the city by the same route she had entered it, which felt like the right thing to do. The late summer day had softened into early fall, and the banners along the lampposts had been taken down, the ones that had said Caldwell City, moving forward together, with the mayor's name at the bottom. The lampposts stood bare in the morning light, waiting for whatever came next. She drove to the eastern neighborhood, where she had grown up, and parked in front of the row house with the narrow porch. A different family lived there. Now she could see toys in the front yard and a bicycle chained to the railing. She sat in the car for a while. She thought about her father at the kitchen table, with his folders spread around him, the lamplight yellow, and the house quiet, except for the sound of his pen moving across paper. He had believed that the systems were real, that the mechanisms of accountability meant something. And he had not been wrong. He had just been too early, or too alone, or too trusting of the channels he was supposed to trust. The channels had failed him. Other channels had eventually not failed him. The truth had gotten out. He had not lived to see it, and she could not undo that. But she could make it mean something by continuing the work, by making sure that the next person who found themselves where her father had found himself did not have to wait 4 years and die before the truth came out. She started the car. She pulled away from the row house and drove toward the highway. And behind her, Caldwell City caught the morning light in its new buildings, and its waterfront, and its redeveloping streets, all of it proceeding, as cities do, forward into whatever version of itself it would become. She thought about the hearing room, about the 43 seconds of audio that had done in less than a minute what 12 months of careful documentation had built toward. She thought about Gerald Holt in his good suit, nodding once when his name was read. She thought about Ashley in the corner booth of the coffee shop, her hands around a cup she had not drunk from, saying the true and necessary thing out loud to another person's face. She thought about her father and the folders and the kitchen table and the long, quiet stubbornness of a man who had believed that the truth was worth the cost of saying it. The highway opened ahead of her, long and flat in the morning light, leading to whatever city came next, whatever file was already compiling itself in the back of her mind. Maya turned on the radio for the first time since she had arrived, a habit she only allowed herself when leaving, and drove with the windows down into the beginning of whatever came next. The work continued. That was the thing about the work. It did not require that you be remembered for it, only that it be done.